for joining this week's Pension Playpen Coffee Morning. Delighted to have Con Keating presenting DB pension funding data and what's going on with DB liabilities. Happy New Year to everybody. Hope you had a fantastic time. I'm absolutely thrilled that Henry Tapper, our chairman, is on the call as well. Henry, delighted to see you. You're looking well. You're looking well. As usual with Pension Playpen, we are now recording. So can we have a thumbs up from everybody? Chris, Henry, thank you very much for the thumbs up. We're now recording. Con wants this to be a little bit interactive. So if you'd like to ask any questions as we go through, then please raise a hand. I will also open the chat room. And if you'd like to make any comments in the chat, that's fine. But I will bring you in to see if you'd like to interject and make any comments to Con and his presentation. So without any further ado, I will pass over to Con, and thanks in advance, Con, for this. I hope you all enjoy it, and over to you, Con.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed, Steve. Well, first of all, let me wish everybody the very best for the new year. I'm also going to mention one thing because it's one of my New Year's resolutions. Can I suggest that you might like to go and have a look at a website, which is Flight for Plight, which I've been involved in for some time. And we are looking to raise more money for Afghani refugees. But go and have a look at that website and see what you think of it. Helena Kennedy is the patron of it. Anyway, let's get on with the presentation in hand. This is joint work with Ian Clacker from Leeds. It's part of something we've been doing now for some 3-4 years. With luck, Ian may be able to join us for some of this session, but he's got administrative nonsense to take care of at Leeds. Anyway, let's just, we've seen there's been press coverage of the revisions made by the PPF in the Purple Book. And I just want to cover those revisions and, much more importantly, an earlier revision to the data which was made by the PPF back in July. It was actually published and got no press comment at all at the time. It was actually published in the response to the low dependency funding code and the standard approach that TPR was recommending to low dependency. Anyway, let's just start by restating the problem. And this you've seen before. It's a statement of the asset values, and what we have been worried about has been divergences between the asset values being reported by both TPR and PPF relative to those being reported by the ONS. And you can see here the decline in asset values over the period from December 21 until March 24. We have not seen any TPR numbers, and I don't believe they've actually published any beyond December 23. The point here is a very simple one. The declines being reported by the ONS as a result of their survey are much, much larger than those of those being reported by TPR and PPF. I mean, as of December 23, the TPR was saying that schemes had 327 billion more in assets than the ONS survey was reporting, and the equivalent number for PPF was 237 billion. Now, there's also a problem between TPR and PPF numbers. These are asset values. They should be fundamentally the same for both PPF and TPR. If anything, PPF numbers should be a little higher because these assets include some pension, some buy-in insurance policies, and those policies are worth more than their face value to the PPF. But that's basically the problem. The scale is important. We move from, in the case of TPR, TPR assets being reported as being 3.6% less than the ONS survey in March of 22 to being 127% higher than ONS in December 23. So that's the problem. We did look at whether or not the ONS survey could be the cause of the problem. The ONS sample is a collection of 614 schemes. It's 100% of the two biggest stratifications that they use. In total, while this is only 12% of schemes, it covered, by our reckoning, between 70 and 75% of the assets of schemes over back in the period that we're looking at. This is actually, this was based in 2021. We worked out that that was 75% value. Most recently, in the Purple Book, the PPF reports ONS survey covering about 80% of assets. This is probably now reasonable, given that the assets of smaller schemes have actually performed less well than those of larger schemes. Anyway, what we did using data we had collected, we collected over 1,000 scheme asset values for 22 and 23, and just did a simulation. Monte Carlo was 10,000 reps, and looked at what we expected things to do. Now, the reported values are quite interesting because our simulation showed the universe going down by about 24.3%, whereas the ONS overall survey was down by 27% for this year, for that year from March 22 to March 23. PPF was down by just 13.7% over that period, and TPR was down by 13.9%. Now, that meant that the 4,600 odd schemes not covered within the ONS would have produced returns of minus 33.9% to arrive at the number which ONS reported. That's worse than was reported by the larger schemes, but consistent with anecdote that we were hearing. Neither PPF nor TPR were producing numbers which made sense. To arrive at the finally published numbers, or the originally published numbers of PPF and TPR, you needed the small schemes to have actually had positive returns of 14.5% and 15.3%. So our simulation suggested the ONS numbers were correct, or if not correct, were more plausible than those of either TPR or PPF. So let's have a look.
Can I interrupt? We've got a hand
Yeah.
raised. I'm delighted to welcome Henry Tapper, who wants to ask a question. Henry?
Henry.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could the reason for these numbers being different being the definition of what a private funded DB scheme is? Because you might want to exclude local governments, parliament schemes, and other government sponsored funded schemes from.
Okay.
Is that a possible
No,
explanation?
no, it's not a possible explanation, Henry. These are private sector DB schemes for both TPR, PPF, and ONS. The ONS collects and publishes separate data for public sector schemes, such as the local authority schemes. Okay?
Okay, that's fine.
There's no possibility for confusion there. Now, let's just plot some of these relations because it gives us some insight which we may not have captured. Here, what I've done is simply plot the ONS reported asset value and TPR's reported asset value. And there are quite clearly two regimes in there. The red, and that's a regression line run through the red, and the blue. The last of those red data points is September of 2022. So this is immediately after the Bank of England interventions in the gilt market. Now, we had a clear and predictable relation prior to the Bank of England intervention, but that which is subsequent to the Bank of England is basically something which is not far removed from noise. The R squared on those first 4 data points from December of 2021 to September of 2022 is 0.99%. The R squared in the subsequent period is just 7%. So two distinctly different regimes, and the one after the Bank of England intervention is not far removed from noise. I would draw your attention to the constants that are in those regression lines. Minus 300 billion in the earlier period and plus 905 billion. Basically, the numbers being produced by TPR after the bank intervention are not far removed from a constant with a bit of noise added to it. It's quite scary. So there was quite clearly need for close attention to the data. This is just a plot of the relationship between TPR and PPF. And again, we expect these are asset values. This really should be one-to-one, but it isn't. I mean, PPF seems to report on average a lower asset value than TPR, and the R squared, the degree of agreement among these, is pretty weak at 86%. So then we'll just plot PPF versus ONS. And again, we see very similar relationships. A high R squared for the period before the crisis, and then, well, before the bank intervention, and a completely different arrangement in the period after. This can really only be taken as being due to the fact that the PPF data sets take as their feedstock TPR's data. let's just recap how big these differences were. Here we go from minus 30 billion, minus 62 billion at the height with TPR to TPR being 327 billion, greater than ONS in December of 2023. I want to draw your attention to one thing in particular about the TPR, the relative TPR shifts. If you look at the period from December of 2022 to December of 2023, we see as near as makes no difference a 4% increase in the extent to which TPR is overestimating asset values relative to the ONS. It's fairly consistent through there. It's also interesting that there are some large movements evident in the data sets. I'll draw attention to the difference between March of 22 and June of 22 for PPF, where PPF reported a huge relative difference relative to TPR, a difference which is partly caught up by TPR in the following quarter. But these ought to be far more similar than they are or than they were. So what were the worst of the differences? It's easy to lose sight of just how large the changes were. During the period from December 21 to March of 2023, March of 2023 was the date at which PPF and TPR published revisions. These are before the revisions. ONS decline was reported as being just under 600 billion, or approximately a third of the asset values at the beginning of the period, at the beginning of 2022. The numbers being reported by TPR and PPF were hundreds of billions lower than that. At the worst, which was September of 2023, the ONS asset values had declined by 710 billion, down 39% from their December 2021 close value. And TPR and PPF numbers are there for completeness. Now, these are the revisions which were published. TPR's revisions, these are revisions as of March 2023. TPRs were published without any real commentary in that response to the DB low dependency consultation. I can send you the reference or the paper itself if you'd like to see that. TPR's revision was to drop asset values by 131 billion, or a decline of 9.3%. PPF's revisions contained in the Purple Book are larger than TPR's. They start from a slightly smaller number than TPR, but also have the decline larger than TPR. So a decline of 9.3% for TPR and a decline of 11.8% for the PPF. Now, that 166 billion number is quite interesting. It happens to be the number that we estimated for losses in the 2022 year. But I think that may just be a coincidence. Now, this is the part where we have real concern. Not only did they lower the asset values, they also revised down the liability values. Now, I can't see any real justification for doing that, and we'll talk about this in some more length. TPR revised its liability values down by 1107 or to 1107 billion, a difference of 96 billion. That's an 8% decline. PPF showed a very much smaller decline, just 14 billion, down 1%, which seems to us to be perfectly plausible. Now, this is what PPF had to say about what they were changing in their revisions. And they make statements about considering cash flows from benefits paid and a few other things in there. This is all deeply problematic. I'll leave you to read that in your own time. But what I want to show is this. This is what PPF showed as being its revisions. Now, start with the cash flows. The net cash flow effect is, according to them, relatively small. PPF drift or actual inflation, they have liabilities rising by 60 billion, which is interesting when you consider that TPR had liabilities declining by 96 billion. This is somewhat surprising. Then we've got refined roll forward and indices. There's no attempt at correction in here for any of the realized losses in the 2022 year. This is just an assumption that everything continued, and yet we know there were real losses realized by people. Let's just examine the benefits paid line. Now, the benefits paid, and here we show 3 years of benefits paid, 66 billion, falling to 51 billion in 23-24. Now, if a revision was reflecting what went on in 2022, and these numbers weren't being considered by PPF, then there should have been an even larger difference back in the year before the beginning of 2022, simply because the benefits numbers are more important. And in that, you can't, and prior to 2022, there was statistically insignificant differences between the numbers being reported by PPF and TPR. There's also the question of whether these should be net contributions or gross contributions that they're adjusting for. And it really, the same trend is evident there. The differences would have been larger before, when there were no differences being reported, than they are after. And for completeness, we show the breakdown of employer contributions there between normal contributions and DRCs. It really doesn't hold water, nor does another suggestion, which is that there's a suggestion made that derivatives may have had a material effect. These are the numbers being reported by the ONS for the net effect of swaps on asset values. These numbers are just simply not large enough to account for the differences that we have been talking about.
Con, we've got a question, a hand raised again by Henry. Henry, do you want to interject and ask a question?
Yeah, what's a DRC? What does that stand for?
Deficit repair contribution, Henry.
Thank you very much.
Okay. They after 2022, they dropped off like a cliff because scheme funding improved, and people very hurriedly cut back their DRCs. Here's just a set of the numbers as reported by ONS and PPF. What I would draw attention to is the December 23 number being reported by the PPF is a statistically significant outlier in that data set. So here's revised PPF versus ONS. So this is addressing the question, can the PPF numbers be relied on going forward? When it appears that PPF will overstate scheme asset values, very small sample set, we've only got 5 data points, given that we only have quarterly reporting from the ONS. We will update this over time, but this would suggest that the PPF numbers are still going to overstate scheme assets. Now, I just want to address probably the most important thing here. The problems that we have here come about because of recognised and realised scheme losses in the 2022 period, and the noise and nonsense that's been published since the end of 2022 is starting from a misstatement of scheme assets, and that will cause returns and asset values subsequently being reported to be higher and moving further away from ONS numbers than might have been reported. So let's see if we can see what actually went on in here. This, I think, is quite interesting. The ONS publishes asset values for LDI pooled funds, gilts, and corporates. And in the first 2 quarters of 2022, we see the relationship that we expect. LDI funds had produced larger negative values than either gilts or corporate bonds because LDI funds were levered. And this continues into 2022, when again you see LDI funds producing larger losses than either gilts or corporate bonds. And corporate bonds early on in rate rises can be expected to lag the performance of gilts. So gilt losses would be expected in those periods to have been larger than corporate bond losses. It's also, there's a second effect in there, which is that the duration of the gilt portfolio is actually longer than the duration of the corporate bond portfolio. Corporate bonds probably have an average duration of around 8 years, whereas that's over 10 for gilts. Then in the 3rd quarter of 2022, we saw something very interesting. LDI funds did not decline, the value of LDI funds did not decline as much as either gilts or corporate bonds. And that simply can be attributed to gilts and corporate bonds, and most particularly corporate bonds being sold to buy or make additional contributions into pooled LDI funds. This becomes staggeringly evident when you see the next quarter, Q4 of 2022, when LDI funds increased by 20% against gilts and corporate bonds declining more in the period. The numbers that you see associated with that are probably of the order of 15 to 20 billion coming from gilts or coming from corporate bonds and gilts in the third quarter, and somewhere between 30 and 37 billion coming from gilts and corporate bonds in the fourth quarter. We then see the first quarter of 2023 was positive. Returns were positive everywhere, and we see a small gain for LDI funds. We think that's probably a reflection. The small gain relative to gilts, we think, is a reflection of the lower leverage which was being deployed in LDI funds at that point in time. Then we see 2 quarters of negative returns where LDI funds produced worse returns than gilts, in line with what would have been expected. But then we see 2 quarters where LDI funds really don't perform as expected. If LDI funds had reflected the same relationship to gilts that they had in Q2 and Q3 of 2023, we would have seen a return from LDI funds, not of the 8% or so that's evident, but something closer to 16 or 17%. LDI funds in Q4 of 2023 and Q1 of 2024 underperformed, given what we expect of them, given that they are leveraged funds. Now, the key point I want to make here is we can actually get, or at least the ONS can get, at exactly how much was realized by way of losses. Their questionnaire contains 2 tables, 14A and 14B. This is 14A, but you'll see it asks schemes to report the realized losses or gains relative to the beginning, relative to the previous quarter, and that's done in each quarter. They have the data, they can actually work out exactly what was lost and what was realized in there. I think we should be lobbying the ONS to do the work on this data and give us what is the important thing.
Con,
Now,
sorry to interrupt. John Hamilton, funnily enough, has said, do you have those losses, gains per class in billions? What you're saying is that that data hasn't been available in the past, or this is why
the
ONS
ONS has been collecting it all along. They have just never been publishing it, and they still don't publish it.
And why is that?
There's a lot of data they collect, they don't publish. Why is it? I'm not sure is the answer. I think it would leave 1 or 2. Well, I think it would embarrass the pensions regulator. I mean, if you go back to the liabilities side of things, the corrections they made are relatively small, but the revaluation of liabilities is frankly not credible. It looks awfully like, I mean, a cynic would say that 96 billion downward revision of liabilities was a number that was necessary for them to maintain the fiction that low dependency portfolios have no net cost or no meaningful net cost to implementation. Why does the ONS not publish this stuff? Don't know is the answer. I've never actually asked them why they don't publish it. I have asked them if they would publish it, and they have said no. Sorry, John, is that sufficient?
John, does that answer your question, John? Do you want to unmute John? And maybe he's having problems unmuting. But
That's all right.
you think
I,
there may
I
be.
like people who are muted.
There you go.
Happy New Year, John.
Happy New Year, John.
Let's just end on a slightly more positive note. The 2000 and the old PPF booklet, the Purple Book, produced some values for buyout liabilities, which I queried at the time, and Ian and I queried these. They showed an improvement in buyout funding from 72%, 79% rather, to 112%. And the huge element in this was the decline in liability values. Frankly, that simply was not credible. But it was what they published. The revision brings that much more into line. We now see the liability values down to, in fact, up to 137 billion from the earlier estimated 125. And again, I'll remind you, TPR reduced liabilities in their low dependency publication. Here we have PPF increasing its estimate of buyout liabilities. And buyout liabilities are not that far removed from low dependency values. I mean, a 90% funding ratio for schemes overall on a buyout basis seems plausible. And it's improved slightly in the subsequent year to 94.4%. But that revision is, I think, a positive note in there. Their buyout numbers are far more plausible than they were before. That brings me to the end of the presentation. Let's take any questions.
Actually, Con, my first question is relating to that buyout slide, which is, where does that really leave the industry? I know William McGrath's here from C-Suite, and I know Adrian's on from Safe Covenant, but where does that leave schemes with the potential for run-on? Does that encourage run-on more or less based on those figures? Do you think schemes are actually in a worse position than they think they are, and they are not that much closer to buyout than they think they were? What's your thought there?
No, schemes are as close to buyout or not as their own valuations are telling them. These are aggregate numbers for the system overall. What we are saying is that these aggregate numbers are not credible. The buyout numbers are more credible now than they were before. But if we have an aggregate 90% buyout funded, then we have perhaps 35% of schemes which are in a position to consider buyout, okay, or run on. Those schemes who are, and that leaves something of the order of 65 to 70% of schemes which are unable at the present time to do a buyout from their own resources. They have no option other than to run on if they are, well, I guess they could go to their sponsor employer and ask for the sponsor employer to pay the difference, but that difference is going to be very substantial. But the numbers that a scheme has for its own scheme are what they are. The problem is in the aggregates and drawing conclusions about the marketplace overall. Clear?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I understand that. So the other question I've got, and again, if anybody would like to ask a question, raise a hand. The other question I've got is, where is this leading to, Con? What would you like to see? I mean, every quarter, you and Ian just see, figures that are sometimes poles miles apart. What's your view? And then we'll come to Tom McPhail.
Well, I think the situation we have, okay, we don't have to panic. Basically, the differences arise because there's a 2-year lag effectively in the way in which the pensions regulator collects its data and the data which it supplies to the PPF. They are using roll forward methodologies and not capturing realized losses, for example. Now, given time, that will correct itself because the most recent numbers which TPR supplied to PPF contained perhaps 20% current valuations. And by current valuations, I mean valuations which included the effects of 2022. Give it another 2 years and all scheme valuations will reflect those 2022 experiences. So the difference will iron itself out over that 2-year period. What would I like to see? What do I think the problem now is? I think the problem is the low dependency funding regime. The original impact assessment associated with the legislation was produced by the pensions regulator for the DWP, and it was based on asset values which were 300 billion overstated. They've corrected 131 billion of that in the number that they published when they were responding to the last consultation. They also managed to lower liability estimates by 96 billion. So you're talking about a 220, 230 billion decline overall. But again, it's understating the true impact of low dependency on the overwhelming majority of schemes.
Right. Okay. Tom, can I bring you in? Then we'll come to William.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Con. Really interesting. So, and forgive me if this is a stupid question. So just tell me if it is. Can you talked, about the forensic work you've done in trying to identify the disparities in the aggregate data. You've also talked about the fact that at a scheme level, the schemes are what the schemes are, with their assets and liabilities, and the schemes are just doing what they do. Can you talk a bit about what you see are the kind of decision making and policy consequences of these data disparities that you've highlighted? Where does this go, and where do you think the problems will occur as a result of these disparities? Thanks.
Well, I think the big problem is that we're going to have fast track and so on coming in, and people are going to want to put themselves into fast track simply because that will get less attention. The problem with that is that you are setting a funding level which is gilts plus a half, and you're imposing that on schemes which were on their existing discount rates, which probably would have been gilts plus 1.5 to gilts plus 2, in that range. You are imposing funding costs which are far higher than are necessary. Um, the the last thing any pensions trustee should be wanting to do now is to be going to their sponsor asking for further deficit repair contributions to chase a funding level which is gilts plus a half. Yeah, I know that if I were the finance director of a scheme, the trustees came to me and said, well, we're not going to be using gilts plus 1.5 anymore. We're going to be using gilts plus a half. I'd tell them where they could go. The big problem is this regime of low dependency. It's not needed. We have the PPF there. Yeah, okay, benefits are not as good under PPF as they are under scheme arrangements, but that disparity is rapidly becoming smaller. PPF benefits are full for pensioners in payment, albeit not necessarily with the same inflation adjustments. But differences which were huge when the PPF was first introduced, over things like pre-97 benefits and the lack of any inflation adjustment under PPF rules. The PPF gap might have been 25% for a fairly typical scheme back in 2006 when it was set up. That number today is probably around 13%. It's roughly speaking halved over the period since the PPF was created. So the losses to scheme members are much smaller now than they used to be. There's probably a case for redress for a really smart lawyer to go to work on in that, by the way.
Okay, interesting. William, you got your hand raised. Do you want to unmute?
Yeah. No, so my question is, I was very interested in the cash flow that you were talking about, the actual payments out per annum by the aggregate of schemes at 50 billion, 51 billion, I think you were talking about. A couple of questions really about why that had fallen from the earlier years, and is there stats on where the numbers are going next? Because I was just thinking, I've got 50 billion a year, and you've got, let's say, 1.2 trillion in assets under management. Do those two numbers relate?
Where do they go over time? Well, those numbers get smaller over time for a very simple reason. The number of pensioners being covered is now declining. The membership of when PPF was first set up back in 2006, you had some 14 million members of DB schemes. That number now is 8.8 million. why are those numbers? Why are the benefits paid numbers declining? I don't like to say this, William, but people are dying.
Colin, but it's not. That doesn't account for a 23% reduction over 2 years. I presume what's happened there, they've taken out the buyout numbers, or you can't go from 67 million. You've got agreed there'll be people who drop out, but you've also got 3, 4, 5% inflation.
Oh,
don't
forget, yeah. The universe has shrunk by a bit, but you can't account for all of that by buyout. Buy-in is contained within these numbers.
Yeah.
Okay, and there's about 150 billion of that at market value. Buyout doesn't, buyout drops capital values, perhaps 80 billion. In the period that we're looking at here, the buyout numbers are less than 20 billion, figure a 5% yield. That's $1 billion. You're not going to get from 66 to 51. That's all from 66 to.
You're thinking there's a 23% reduction benefits actually paid to pensions, or you think there's some issue with the numbers? I just can't see it's going to fall by 23%.
Well, these are the reported numbers. The statement. Well, actually, I can't do it immediately because I don't have it on this particular laptop. I can have a look at the breakdown of benefits paid, and no, from memory, there's a small increase in capital sums being taken. I will go away and double check the numbers.
Our scheme, Con, as it happens, is about 1/1000th of the DB universe.
Yeah.
As it happens, and our pension payments have been kind of stable around 60 million for the last 3 years. We've got inflation, but it's closed schemes, so we've consistently been about 1/1000th of the universe for 1.2, 1.3 billion. So
well, I'll read. I appreciate, John. I will recheck the numbers, but these are the numbers I think from. Well, they are the numbers from the ONS, so they're the numbers reported to the ONS. I will have a look at where the declines have occurred, but my key point here anyway was it doesn't actually matter that whether these numbers decline or just hold steady. If they hold steady, my original critique here is that if it's the difference between benefits paid, which was drawing PPF numbers and TPR numbers adrift, then it doesn't matter whether they're declining or steady. Why weren't the differences evident before 2022? That was my critique here, John. Are you with me? If the number was 66 before, if it's 66 now, and that's the number they corrected for, then it should have been evident before, and it wasn't. But interesting point about I haven't thought about the magnitudes of those declines. I will have a closer look.
Can I just come back on Tom McPhail's earlier comments on what does all this mean? I mean, the low dependency target of gilts plus a half. I mean, from a regulatory perspective, there's no science to that. It's just that from a regulatory or political perspective, they want DB schemes to be more funded rather than less. And gilts plus a half politically is more than gilts plus one or gilts plus 1.5.
Yes.
So the regulator just wants more rather than less. And they thought they kind of won the lottery when September 22 happened, and all of a sudden schemes were more or less fully funded on gilts plus a half. So they try to make that a base level which you couldn't back off from. But that only holds if you don't take into account the 300 million loss of assets. So that regime of gilts plus a half is only supportable if you ignore the 350 or so million loss in assets. And if that's still the regime now that they will coerce schemes towards, that'll be 350 million either needs to come from investment returns, but that's not feasible on a low dependency basis, or from sponsors and members. So it's there's no science to why it's a gilts plus. You could equally
no, I
gilts plus 1.5.
John, I couldn't agree more with you. There is no science to gilts plus a half. There's also no science to gilts plus 1.5. What we should have been using as a discount rate all along was the expected return on assets. If you have to have a discount rate based present value regime, there's actually a very strong argument that what you should be doing in pension funds is not using a discounted present value approach, but rather using a cash flow projection approach, which of course is very similar to what we did back in the 1980s.
So it's a political messaging that more funding is better than less. So for 20 years, it's just let's get a bit more. It's like squeeze until the pips squeak. But the issue with gilts plus a half is we've sucked all investment perspective out of our economy.
Yes.
So, but there's been no voice for investment.
I mean, well, what do you own at gilts plus a half? Well, you own a lot of gilts and a few corporate bonds, and forget buying equity. And to a large extent, also forget buying private equity.
And I genuinely think
private equity is going to get private equity. By the way, Ian and Chris Sear and the guys at Clearglass have some very interesting findings that they'll be publishing towards the end of this month. Actually, at Stephen Glover's private equity, private finance conference on, I think, the 28th. But that basically shows private equity makes general partners rich and nobody else. This the demands for ever more funding that we've seen for 20 odd years, that's the cause of the lack of corporate investment and a great deal of the lack of growth in productivity. We've been demanding cash from sponsors, and they've paid it in to meaningful contributions. 14 billion a year, 21, 22, 22, 23. Those deficit repair contributions. That's money which could have been invested in the UK economy.
Many zombie manufacturers.
Yes. Yes. And of course, a number of them have in fact become zombies largely because they haven't invested when they should have done. Yeah. But there we are.
Okay. Well, Con. Chris, you've put quite a few questions in the chat. I know we're sort of towards the end, but Chris, do you want to just unmute and ask a few questions of Con, and then we'll wrap up? Do you want to unmute, Chris?
Yeah. Right. Perhaps if I go backwards, the long-term expected return, that's obviously going to be difficult to agree on, but there is a benchmark which we've been using, which we could have been using together with the ILG real yield, and then we'd have had the long-term expected rate of inflation, which, if you think about it, the rate of growth of liabilities, i.e. the inflation rate in liabilities, is the key metric in a DB scheme.
Yes, I agree with you on the rate of inflation being important. One of the things that concerned me about PPF is PPF do talk in their causes for various things about the high inflation that we experienced in 22, 23. But they have a very substantial upward adjustment, which seems to me to be too high, because schemes were using an expected inflation rate of between 3 and 3.5%, most of them. So even if you, for PPF purposes, take that up to 5%, which is where most schemes are capped, 75% of schemes are capped at 5 or lower. That's not going to give you the 50, 60 billion numbers. It's going to give you numbers of the order of magnitude of 15 to 30 billion.
Yeah.
And
the irony is, of course, Con, that if we'd used the expected inflation rate, despite the overvaluation of the gilt market over the last decade and a half, we've actually seen a consistency between 3 and 3.5% on that expected inflation rate, if only we'd used it.
No, the market implied inflation rate has been remarkably steady, which is surprising when you consider just how ludicrously expensive the gilt market became. We did have gilts being RPI 10-year gilt, I think, had a low of RPI less 320. There were periods when the ILG market was seriously out of whack. It's also quite interesting that we are now back at conventional gilt yields, which are higher now than they were at the end of the crisis. The highest you and I saw during the crisis on the 20-year gilt was 508, and this morning we're seeing 519, 520. Liability values are quite low currently.
In discounted terms.
I think that what we're likely to see is that as gilt yields decline, which I think they have to do over the coming couple of years, scheme funding will become an issue again. We may be looking at the best scheme funding we'll see for a very long time.
And on that bombshell, Con, this is the best it's going to get. That's basically what you're saying, Con, yeah?
I think that's a distinct possibility.
Wow. Okay. Well, on that note, I think I'm going to say thank you very much to everybody for joining. Big thanks to Con for his great input, and lots of claps and virtual claps will no doubt follow. Con, we've had a few requests for the copy of the slides. Are you happy for the slides to be sent out?
Absolutely. Yeah, send them to anybody.
Okay. If anybody wants the slides, please email me or Henry.
Now, just to let you know, we have produced a blog which is going to appear in the Securities Institute Review as an article. Henry will publish that once it's appeared within the Securities Institute Review. Don't know when that's going to be. There's also going to be another webinar for the Securities Institute or Chartered Institute of Securities and Investment, covering the same topic.
Can I pipe up for one moment?
Yeah.
Hello, Con. Always a pleasure, and thank you very much indeed. And I'm very happy to see Henry back in action again. I just wanted to share with the others a cunning plan that Con shared with me in terms of a scheme surplus. We're going to merge our DC and DB schemes so that we can transfer a surplus from the DB scheme to the DC scheme, and maybe offset up to a couple of 100K a year DC employers' contributions. Thank you for that, Con. I just wanted to pipe up with it in case it might be of use to anybody else.
Well, for many people that can already be done. It just depends on the way in which the trust is set up.
We're going to
There's
merge them.
It's one for the lawyers.
Yeah.
But you know what? I'm going to come back and recommend to everyone again, given that you've just come in, Charles, and you are the principal involved in Flight from Light. Please go and have a look at that website and get your checkbooks out as well.
Thank you, Con. Bless your heart. Con has been helping us support a school for street children in Kabul, girls and boys, secular education. He's also helped us evacuate. I think the total now is 14 Afghans wanted by the Taliban. The latest news, Con, is that the last 5 who we were helping in Pakistan have been told by the Americans they're going to go to Qatar to be finally screened before going to the United States.
Brilliant.
Con's been a great supporter. The website is www.flightfromplight.org. Do hope you have a moment to have a look at it. And once again, Con, you're a trooper.
Donada.
Fantastic. Appreciate it. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Next week, we've got LCP talking about stewardship. So hopefully you can all join LCP next week. And Con, thank you again for today's presentation. We pray for peace in the East and peace in the Middle East. And actually, Henry, we pray for your speedy recovery as well. So thank you. Yes, speedy recovery, Henry. Come on. So there we go. But Con, thank you very much. If anybody wants the slides, please contact me or Henry. Brilliant. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of your week. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much, everybody, and Happy New Year. Cheers.
Happy New Year to one and all.
Year.
Good stuff. Thanks, guys.
Well done, Con. Bye. Bye.